evening. Welcome to the lecture of Riccardo Bellofiore, Marx, Critique of Machinery and Technology in Kapital and the Grundrisse. My name is Valeria Bruschi and I will moderate tonight. First of all, I would like to thank the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research for the support to the lectures at the Marx Autumn School this year. The topic of the Autumn School this year is Techniques and Capital in Marx. This is the first part of a discussion we will continue next year, so stay tuned and I hope we will see us in 2024. Something about the schedule. The Marx Autumn School continues tomorrow at 9 o'clock. The early bird workshop will take place, and afterwards at 11 o'clock, Gavin Müller will speak about Ludism, autonomy and sabotage. Yesterday and today in the workshops we discussed about Marx's reflections on techniques in Kapital and the Grundrisse. I am now very glad to sit here with Riccardo Bellofiore. He will present us tonight his readings of chapter 11, 12 and 13 of Kapital on cooperation, work division and mechanism. Two words about Riccardo Bellofiore. He was professor for political economy in Bergamo until retired. And this year he teaches history of economic theory at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. He worked and works on theories of value, monetary, macroeconomics, tendencies of contemporary capitalism, history of economic analysis, philosophy of economy. Among his most recent publications, I would like to mention the work The Adventures of Socialisation in 2018, published in 2018, and Smith, Riccardo, Marx, Sraffa, published in 2020. And he supervised, together with Stefano Breda, the Italian edition of The Science of Value by Michael Heinrich. And he is working on a new book in English, which, as he says, he will probably never finish. And as he says, it is good for us because the manuscript has between 700 and 1,000 pages. The working title is There Life on Marx? So, Riccardo.
Thanks, Valeria. It's okay? Do you hear me? Yes. Thanks, Valeria, and thanks to the Marx Schule for having invited me. This is the second time. The first time was in 2010. I usually do the thanking at the beginning because it's better to do that so otherwise you may not be very happy at the end, so one never knows. I realized this morning, thanks to the wonderful option of Facebook about what happened in the past, that actually I began my studies in economic theory and on Marx exactly 50 years ago. In October 1973, I was studying law, but in October 1973, I started going to the lectures of Claudio Napoleoni. He was translated in German. There is a book, Riccardo und Marx, edited by Cristina Pennavaglia. Claudio Napoleoni was very much influenced at the time by Lucio Colletti. And in those years, I was involved politically with Il Manifesto group. Maybe some among you may know the name Rossanda. I named these three because Napoleoni, Colletti, and Rossanda were born in 2024. that is next year will be 1 century. So the Rosa-Luxemburg Stiftung may organize something. I also realized that exactly 10 years ago, we finished a Kapital reading group, which lasted 9 years. And what I will say this evening is very much indebted to those young people, to the students in Turin, which in the year after invited me to do lectures on the first volume of Kapital. Those who know Italian find them on YouTube. And the workers in Turin, at the time they were mostly at Fiat, with whom I made political activity in those years. So my beginning with Marx was exactly due to Napoleon, and I have to thank students and workers. I will give a look, as it was said before, to the chapters 11 and 12 very quickly, and in more detail, chapter 13 on Maschinenfaktory of Das Kapital Erste Band. I will be very quick because of lack of time on the fragment on machine. I have written a paper which is also, I think, translated in German with Max Tomba, so there you may find more arguments. I will raise too many issues to anticipate, but I will try to underline what I think may be the more controversial facts in my interpretation. Let's start with cooperation. Marx writes, here you will find a lot of things in italics. It is Marx. Not in italics, it is me. The bold is for evidence. Marx writes that when numerous workers work together side by side in accordance with the plan, this form of labor is called cooperation. And Marx also writes that the spatial productive power of the combined working day, the individual workers put together, is the social productive power of labor, that is the productive power of this labor which has been put together, social labor. These powers arise from cooperation itself. Cooperation is not necessarily capitalistic, but it is included. It has a capitalistic imprint in this society. Then there is this quote on which we'll come back later, probably, which I find important. When the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, she or he strips off the fetters, shrunk its like barrier of his individuality, and develops the capabilities of this species. This is also, in fact, in italics. Gattungsvermögen. We will see that in chapter 13, this point is developed in an intriguing and maybe controversial way. My reading, or my interpretation, is that this is an historically specific situation. We are moving from a situation in which there is the individual worker. Adam Smith very much stressed this individuality of the laborer, to a work that Marx will define in chapter 13, the immediately socialized worker. Workers are put together, but how? It is capital that put together the wage laborers. Marx writes, wage laborers cannot cooperate unless they are employed simultaneously by the same capital. It is capital that pushes forward cooperation, and, says Marx, the productive power developed by the workers socially is the productive power of a strong statement. The productive power, this is my interpretation of social labor, can only manifest itself as the productive power of capital. It is an Erscheinung, not a shine. It is not a semblance. Erscheinung means that it is a manifestation of things as they really are. Then Marx says, as the number of the cooperating workers increases, so too does their resistance to the domination of capital and necessarily the pressure put on by capital to overcome this resistance. Marx, in these 3 chapters, never forgets class struggle, and here class struggle in production, which is key to the fluidification of labor. I am quoting from the Penguin translation. There are 2 main translations in English. The other one is the old one by Edward Aveling and Stanley Moore, I think, something like that. The Penguin is better than the older one, but it is no good whatever. I don't go into the detail, but my argument is that the English translations of Kapital are bad even when they are good on specific points. I can't explain. So sometimes I will correct. But here the point I am making is that class struggle in production for Marx is also key because of the origin of the fluidification of labor. In German, it refers to Flüssig, something like that. This is systematically hidden in English. It is not translated in this way. Let us go to chapter 12. The manufacturing division of labor. The division of labor, which may be not necessarily capitalistic, how it is developed in this stage in the era of manufacturing. The collective worker, because now we are talking of the collective worker, constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture. It is, in fact, we will say later, the machinery of manufacture. And it is made up by specialized detail workers. There is a reference and also a criticism to Adam Smith several times in the chapter. Fragmentation, specialization, there is the analysis of how the collective workers is constructed. I don't go into that. The point is that these workers that are specialized, that are fragmented, have a skill which becomes a lifelong destiny of the human being. It is a trap. Handicrafts, artigianato in Italian, remains, says Marx, the technically narrow basis. It is so narrow that it excludes a really scientific division of the production process into its component parts. This will be crucial in chapter 13 as the notion of technology. Technology is much more important than the notion of technique. And it was clearly there in the first edition. In the second edition, mostly Marx, for some reason, changed all the technique in technology except in a few key points. Work in manufacturing is cooperative, and because it is cooperative, it requires continuity, uniformity, regularity, order, and intensity of work. Socially necessary labor time, which was imposed by competition, now becomes a technical necessity of the labor process itself. My interpretation is that now the concrete labor of the individual worker, this is actually my concrete labor is no longer of the individual worker, but of the collective worker. The individual worker does not produce the commodity. The collective workers produce them. So, for the collective worker, there is the concrete and abstract labor, but not anymore for the individual worker. Marx says that these results comes from a naturwüchsige gesellschaftliche process. In Italian, it's translated by Fineschi as matured spontaneously, maturato spontaneamente. I am not completely happy with this translation because it is not always good. In fact, this is a spontaneous and natural but social outcome. What does mean but social? It is a historical occurrence which is naturalized. So it's not really natural in the true sense. Here we have another key distinction which is hidden in many translations and also to many interpreters, between fetish character and fetishism. Fetish character is the situation in which the thing as a fetish really is endowed of social powers. The social powers are really there, but not because that is the natural thing. It is the thing in those social relations. If you naturalize the social powers, this is fetishism. So fetish character is one thing, fetishism is a very, very different thing. Then Marx says in this chapter, this will become more and more important in chapter 13, that knowledge, judgment, and will are faculties that are now required only for the workshop as a whole, not for individual worker. And then again, he goes to a point which I already raised for cooperation. The productive power which results from the combination of various kinds of labor appears, this is the Penguin translation, as the productive power of capital. Now, in English, very often appears is used both for erscheinen and scheinen. Here it is erscheinen. So I would prefer that you get this as a phenomenal manifestation, not a semblance. And we arrive to chapter 13. We will stay more on chapter 13 than we did on chapter 11 and 12. Chapter 13 is large-scale industry. Marx writes, manufacture was the transformation, in manufacture, the transformation of the mode of production takes labor power as its starting point. In large-scale industry is the other way around. It is the instruments of labor that are the starting point. If you go back to chapter 5, as for the numeration of the chapters, I use the 4th German edition, not the numeration of the English edition. The rest will be chapter 7. In chapter 5, the tool stood between the worker and the object of work. Now the thing is changing. Now the human being is the controller, but at the same time, human being is becoming the instrument of the instrument. This is an inversion. I think in German is unique. At the beginning of chapter 13, then there is a long footnote on technology. Marx begins these footnotes making a plea for an history of technology as the history of the development of the productive organs of the human being, like Darwin did. Marx says technology reveals the active relation of human being to nature, the direct process of the production of his life, his or her life, and thereby it also lays bare the process of the production of the social relations of his or her life, and the mental conceptions that flow from those relations. I will come back soon to technology, but I want to stress that in this note there are also a couple of lines which are very important to clarify his, that is Marx's, theoretical project. He says that it is important not just to discover by analysis the earthly kernel of the mystic creations of religion, but it is much more important to develop from the actual given relations of life the forms in which these have been, the English translation as apotheosized, I prefer transpose to the sky, earthly, and transpose to the sky. In fact, it is the point of understanding the semblance, the fetishism. Behind that, the fetish, but also how the fetish is originated. And to do that, in my view, you have to go to the source of the objectification of the fetish, which is exactly the fluid dimension of living labor. For me, it is the starting point of this discourse is the second section of chapter 5, Verwertung process, the process of valorization. On technology, there are important works of a friend of mine since late 70s, early 80s, and he's also a friend of Roberto Finelli, Guido Frison. It is the man of this idea that he has followed all over the history of technical thought, etc. Technology is a cameralist concept from Beckman. It is, here I refer to Guido Frison, it is a technological description of the production process which is possible only from the point of view of those who command the production process. And who are those who command the production process? The capitalist as personification of an impersonal social power. Frison is important both for me and Roberto Finelli. We have never actually discussed the thing we do, but my interpretation of Frison is a bit different than the interpretation of Finelli. And we don't know what is the true one, and we never sat around all three, and I'm not sure that we come something good from that. So, technology defines, in my reading of Frison, a potential relation between labor power and means of production. But it also defines the prefiguration of the changes of this relation. This prefiguration may be forestalled. It's actually related to innovation. But the key point of technology is that this relation, and Marx insists on this point several times in the chapter, is without regard to the human dimension. He quotes Wyatt, that is the machine doing something without the human hand. Technology designs the production process dealing with labor power as a thing among things. This is technology. Technique is something a bit different. It relates to the relations between labor and means of labor, looking at these relations from the point of view of the prescriptions of use related to the means of labor. Then there is a third dimension that should be in bold, but is not, which is the organization of labor, in which human beings must be there more presently. The organization of labor refers to the relations among workers as living labor power. In my view, you cannot analyze the production process only through technology, as Finelli probably would like to, but you need to have all three. Let me also say, being one who was, my Bildung was in the late 60s and in the 70s, let me say also that the Marxist reflection on the labor process is seriously lacking. It is very well known that after Marx we had to wait from Braverman, but Braverman was the beginning of a story, and it was not always good. This notion of degradation of labor, I think, was quite poor. So you have to look at the debate on the labor process after that. these three notions, technology, technique, and organization of labor, are connected but are not the same. Technology is, this mostly a quote from Frison, is a potency which becomes a probable reality thanks to two things which are interacting: the conflict between labor power and entrepreneurs, and the competition between entrepreneurs. Before I'm going on, let me stress that when we speak of labor, at least rigorously from the second edition of Kapital, before Marx was not so clear, not even in the first edition. When we speak of labor, we have to distinguish three things. One is Arbeitskraft, the other is lebendige Arbeit. You may say, of course, everybody says that. It is labor power as capacity to work, living labor, that is labor as activity. But there is also this third notion, lebendige Arbeitskraft, living labor power. Again, this tends to disappear in translations. There are 6 occurrences, sometimes in key moments. Fineschi has only 3 times translated it properly. In the other translations, it's even worse. Labor as activity, it is exactly the fluid which is objectified and congealed. And in my interpretation, the abstract dimension and the concrete dimension of labor are both there, must be there in labor as activity. So in my interpretation, I don't go into that here, the abstraction of labor in Marx is theoretically constructed as a processual notion. You can't have it already defined in production, but you can just say that it exists only in circulation. Lebendige Arbeitskraft, living labor power, is what? It is the workers. The workers looked only as bearers of labor power. That is, the human being, which are free and equal in this society, but regarded only as bearers of labor power. This is a completely unique historical situation. You have to force labor from this subject. This is something which was not there before in history, in my view. So, exploitation as the extraction of labor from this subject is something specifically capitalist. I would go on saying that there is a dual ontology in Marx, because labor power and living labor are of capital. And Marx insists on this again and again and again. At the same time, it is clear, even though it's not so transparent in writing this, that labor power and living labor are attached to living labor power. And in a sense, they cannot remain of living labor power. And this creates, again, an historically specific situation of conflict and class struggle in production. Some of you may say, class struggle in production, I have read this somewhere. Yes, Etienne Balibar in his book on Marx and philosophy, or Marx philosophy. Let's move to manufacture done by hand, machinofacture done by machines. In simple cooperation, this is a quote, and even in the more specialized form based on the division of labor, that is the manufacturing division of labor, the extrusion, I think the suppression of the isolated worker by the associated worker still appears to be more or less accidental. This is the Penguin translation. It is not good, but most of the translations are not good. On this, Fineschi is very good that it is translated as it should be translated. Why? Because associated is Vergesellschaftet. So it should be the suppression of the isolated worker by the socialized worker still appears to be more or less accidental. It's an erscheinung, phenomenal manifestation of things as they are. Marx goes on saying a few lines below. Machinery operates only by means of associated labor or labor in common. In German is machinery operates only by means of unmittelbar vergesellschaftete labor. That is, by means of immediately socialized labor. And this theme, if you read carefully, reappears several times in chapter 30. Marx proceeds saying, hence the cooperative character of the labor process is in this case a technical necessity dictated by the very nature of the instrument of labor. You see that what was already started as a discourse in the manufacturing division of labor goes on. These technical necessities deepens and deepens. Other quote, a system of machinery, because we are moving from the machines to the ensemble of machines, constitutes in itself a vast automaton. Automaton means acting of itself, as soon as it is driven by a self-acting private mover. The automaton as capital, the automaton as capital, and because it is capital, is endowed in the person of the capitalist with the intelligence and will. So we start to have the division of intellectual and manual labor. And Marx goes on saying, we have in place of the isolated machine, a mechanical monster, the system of machines, as a mechanical monster whose body fills all factories, whose demonic power finally bursts forth in the fast and feverish whirl of its countless working organs. And aside, this theme of body is crucial. I cannot go on this as I would like, but I think that it's important to understand this. A short picture of the whole of volume 1 of Kapital, except this section on reproduction, can be given in 5-6 phrases. It is a Gothic novel. Value is a ghost. The intrinsic value in individual commodity, it is ethereal. But as the ghost in Gothic novels, it must take possession of a body. This is an incorporation, but I translate it as an embodiment, taking a body. And when this is done, you have money as money, value as a chrysalis, you have actually value as absolute value. Absolute value or exchange value is a key notion, and most Marxists does not recognize that. If you go and look who recognize that, you have Backhaus, Reichel, Colletti, Napoleoni, and Cristina Pennavaia, not by chance, because Cristina Pennavaia studies with Colletti and Napoleoni and went in the early 70s to study in Germany with Backhaus and Reichel. At this point, this chrysalis, as a good chrysalis, must become a butterfly, but it can do that only if capital becomes a vampire. And what does the vampire? Sucks a fluid, leaving labor. It is not translated sucking, it's translated soak up, absorption, something much more. So it is in anticipation of Dracula returns later, no? So from Mary Shelley to Dracula. This point of body is crucial because, in fact, the system of machinery is the embodiment of capital, but it is it gives way to a second notion of embodiment, which is key in understanding Capital as a whole, the first volume, and this chapter, which is embodiment as including within a body. So it is not the first notion of embodiment is the second is Einverleiben. The first is das Corp, Corporum, something like that. I added at the beginning, but we can go there later. Now, this point about this body of machine, which includes in it the workers, the living labor power, was already anticipated in chapter 5, when Marx speaks of, says, raw materials and the object of labor exist only to absorb, is not absorb, or sucking, the work of others. And Marx says, by incorporating living labor power into the material constituents of capital, the latter becomes an animated monster, here we are, and it starts to act as if consumed by love. Most translations don't say living labor power, say labor power. Fineschi unfortunately says labor power. I think here the Penguin may be right. The quote by Goethe, as if consumed by love, it is crucial. For many years, maybe they get said, oh, what a nice poetic image. It is not. It is a rat who is dying because it is being poisoned. So it's passing from life to death. What happens to living labor power and the living labor? Machinofacture. Then these chapters goes on in a way that shows that, especially the chapter 13, we are not dealing with chapters which are historical. No, here we have arguments that deepen the logical inquiry about capital, and specifically about capital's extraction of the fluid living labor that will be objectified as new value. Marx begins saying that machinery, this is a quote, is the most powerful means of lengthening the working day, extraction of absolute surplus value, turning the whole lifetime of workers and their family into labor time. Here there is also the fact that it increases the supply of labor. I don't go into that, though it would be a very interesting thing. Let me just say that somewhere Marx seems to say that there are limits to absolute surplus value. For the total population, it is not so. The reform pensions of reform, are exactly when they lengthen the social working day on a lifetime, it is absolute surplus value extraction. Then Marx goes on saying, machinery also produces relative surplus value by converting the labor employed by the owner of that machinery into labor of a higher degree, lavoro potenziato in Italian. This is a key point. Chapter 10 is based on the notion that Schumpeter plagiarized, the so-called dynamic competition. Marx had to put this competition in volume 1 for strong theoretical reasons. And they are so strong that they reappear here. So we should go into looking at this Schumpeterian competition, but we cannot do that. Then there will be the other notion of competition, of the tendency to equalization of the rate of profit, which will appear in in volume 3. From the point of view of reconstruction, that is not of interpreting Marx, but going beyond Marx, I would frankly stress much more the dynamic competition, the competition of firms within the sector looking for an extra surplus value, than the tendency to liberate the profit. But that's not to be discussed here. Then Marx goes on, third quote in this page. It happens a change in the nature of relative surplus value, change relative to the chapters before. Marx says the compulsory shortening of the hours of labor from law, conflict, etc., imposes on the worker a compression of a greater mass of labor into a given period. It is an increase in the intensity of labor, which amounts to create more potential value. I don't go into the point, which would be interesting. This is completely un-Ricardian, at least relatively to the Riccardo that we mostly know, which means that is opposite to most Marxists who thinks they are non-Ricardian. But I stop there for the moment. So, here we have the key role of living labor as a fluid. I follow Rosa Luxemburg, which says that actually the wage of the working class is given ex ante when you do the bargaining on the labor power. But after that, before the production process, the living labor is not yet determined, and it will be determined by the conflict, the class struggle in production. So I mix Luxemburg and Balibar. What is Marx saying? Marx is saying, look, we cannot separate absolute surplus value and relative surplus value as if they belong, even for, say, Nagel in many writings, to different ages of capital. No, they are going together. When there is the new machine, to exploit the new machine, you lengthen the working day, but also the machine allows a higher intensity of labor. And when you go to relative surplus value sees going together higher productive power and higher intensity. These 2 points are points that led me and Max Tomba to a theoretical alliances on these points, because we think that these are crucial theoretical determination. I have not the time, because also it is not in this chapter, to go into that. But this issue about fluid living labor, intensity of labor, etc., it is essential to understand Marx on the wage. And today, when people read Marx on the wage, loses a most interesting part, the one in which Marx is talking of how, even with the same money and real wage, the price of labor power can go below the value of labor power, eroding the health of the workers. Then there are other discourses on which I can't go on, about the surplus working population which is created by machines, and the fact that machines, a system of machinery, determines an immanent absolute contradiction. This is the definition by Marx, because it increases the rate of surplus value and at the same time expels the living labor power, which is creating the new value. Very quick on this. Marx has a distinction between machinery and the use of machinery. In the Penguin is machinery and its employment by capital. I don't find it very good, probably because I come from Italy, and this was the point very much stressed by Raniero. Panzieri, early 60s, in the Quaderni Marx says it took both time and experience before the workers learned to distinguish between machinery and the use of machinery, and therefore to transfer their attacks from the material instruments of production to the form of society which utilizes those instruments. This distinction reappears many times. But here there is a problem of which it is not clear if Marx was actually conscious. Because it is Marx, not itself, but Marx himself, that shows that the labor process is deeply scarred in its use value material reality by the formal determination of capital. So this distinction would mean that the machines should have been designed differently, and then probably different machines. I skip here, for record time, very intriguing points of these pages. When Marx speaks of production of machines by means of machines, then he goes saying how this creates the possibility of a higher share of unproductive employment, give hints about the cycle and crisis, but this is premature because it is a theoretical setting which there is no credit, no banks, no finance. But if you put some banks and finance, it comes an intriguing question, because Marx says, with machines there is an impulse for extension of work bearing fruit only in the distant future. And if you put this in a monetary theory, you can build some kind of, if you wish, Hayekian or Minskian, which are very different and opposed, analysis of the tendency in capitalism towards speculative and ultra-speculative positions to accelerate growth. Is this really bad? Should we dream of communist degrowth? I'm not sure that Marx would agree, because most of the good things in capital comes exactly from engaging in speculative and ultra-speculative position. So it's not. Also, this I have to skip brutally. There is a footnote, go and look at that, which is intriguing about the contemporary debate on basic income. Some of you may have met Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi speaks of a Spinamland effect, the parish relief before the introduction of the Poor Law of 1834. And Marx, in this footnote, quotes from some act in which there is this Reverend Mr. Turner, who actually says that yes, the parish relief allowed workers to resist a bit more to the introduction of the hand loom and the power loom, but this was one of the elements that maintained pauperism, creating a situation in which the industrious are reduced from the respectable and in some degree independent mechanic social situation to the cringing wretch who lives on the debasing bread of charity. It is Reverend Turner, but it looks as if Marx agrees with this. Now I go to a point which is when Marx speaks of education and all that. It is a long quote. I will not read all the long quote. This long quote, Marx saying that the development of the factory system alters production everywhere. Then he says that handicrafts and manufacturers break up the multifarious parts of their employment. stress multifarious. This is a necessary aspect of the process of development. Then comes large-scale industry, which destroys the crystallized mystères of handicraft and also manufactures. Large-scale industry tore aside the veil that concealed from human beings their own social process of production, etc. It is the same theme of the manifesto. All that is solid melts into the air. And Marx goes on saying, modern industry never views or treats the existing form of the production process as the definitive one. Therefore, it is revolutionary from the technological point of view. Large-scale industry thus necessitates variation of labor, fluidity of functions, and mobility of the worker in all directions. Yes, it reproduced the old division of labor. And so this is a contradiction. The contradiction has a negative side, the ceaseless human sacrifices. But, says Marx, if at present variation of labor imposes itself with the blindly destructive action of a natural law, large-scale industry, through its very catastrophes, make the recognition of variation of labor and thence of the fitness of the worker for the maximum number of different kinds of labor into a question of life and death. That monstrosity, the disposable working population held in reserve in misery for the changing requirements of capitalist exploitation, must be replaced by the individual human being who is absolutely available for the different kinds of labor required on him. And the partially developed individual, which is also before capital, who is merely the bearer of one specialized social function, must be replaced by the totally developed individual for whom the different social functions are different modes of activity he takes up in turn. You go back to the quote in the chapter on cooperation of Gattun's Vermogen. I told you that I studied Napoleone. Napoleone was influenced by Lucio Colletti. In Marxism and Hegel, the chapter before the last is on social relations of production. It is on the concept of labor and human being in the manuscripts of 1844. The key idea is that human being, as depicted in the manuscripts, is natural and generic. Natural, part of nature. Generic, the mind, the thought, that differentiates him from all other natural beings, that is universal, what is general or common in all things. If you go to the first section of chapter 5, you'll see this very much at work. The idea of Lucio Colletti, and also Napoleone, was that there was a perfect continuity from the 1844 manuscripts to Kapital. And I think it is wrong. Althusser stressed the discontinuity. And I think this is right, but at the same time, it is wrong. Reading Marx backwards from Kapital, going back, allows to discover the continuity in the discontinuity, because Marx redefined his discourse on human being and the labor. Here I have a quote that I don't go into that from the Grundrisse, in which it is clear that Marx says that universally developed individuals are no product of nature but of history. The degree and the universality of the development of wealth, where this individuality becomes possible, Marx says, begins only from the bourgeois era. Lukács saw this in 1923, if I remember right, the date of history and class consciousness. The production on the basis of extra values is a prior condition. It is a situation that produces universality, not only the alienation of the individual from himself and from others, but also the universality and comprehensiveness of his relations, of his capacities. So the discourse of the 1844 is not anymore of a generic Feuerbachtian essence, and it is clearly related to discourse of chapter 13. From here, my position is that you cannot find in Marx a position of refusal of labor as such, as a situation from which you have to exit. Labor as such, I'm not talking of exploited labor, of capitalist labor, wage labor, and so on. Go and look Marx on Smith in the Grundrisse, even the part of labor as the first. Very few things about the fragment on machines. This is the quote, and I don't go, because I have no time, in reading the quote. I started reading Il Manifesto in 1969. They translated the article from Euler's review, I think it was 68, of the guy who translated the Grundrisse in English, which diffused this fragment, which was already known in Italy from Paderni Rossi translation by Renato Soli. It is a fascinating piece. Everybody was fascinated by this. I think it is wrong, but it has some intriguing points. But I want to stress that the fragment of machines relates to wealth. The fact that in the production of wealth, labor time is not anymore crucial. Then the death of Aryan labor time becomes a miserable foundation, and at this point, labor time ceases to be, must cease to be the measure of use value. So we are again at the point of wealth, and with that, production based on value actually breaks down. Maybe it is the only place which Marx is talking about something like a Zusammenbruch theory. My point is that Marx made an explicit self-criticism of this at the end of chapter 10, before beginning the paradigm cooperation. Go a few lines before, and Marx says, quoting the paradox of Quenet, etc., why does the capitalist, whose sole concern is to produce exchange value, continually strive to bring down the exchange value of commodity? Because he's not interested in the shortening of the working day in general. It is interested in increasing productivity, shortening the working time to produce a definite quantity of commodity. But as the chapters until chapter 13 show, this goes exactly together with a lengthening of the working day appropriated by capital. So the two things are not in contradiction. As a personal position, I would radicalize the thing in this way. One thing is the productivity in terms of use value. Well, one thing is the productivity in terms of money, baguettic money, starting from the age of capitalist machines. When we are there, concrete labor, that is workers as doing concrete labor, are included in capital as the system of machines, etc. And from this point of view, the imprint of capital is the whole. It is capital, including in itself concrete labor, that produces the wealth. So the productivity of wealth is entirely of capital. At the same time, the productivity of value remains to labor as abstract labor, because to produce anyhow, capital must always win the class struggle in production and must prolong the living labor over and beyond the necessary labor. Now, Claudio Napoleoni published in 1976 a book, Valore. It's a complicated book because it's a beautiful book, but it is unfortunately very, very wrong in a few key places. The point is that Lucio Colletti, who was in you after Rubin, the greatest interpreter of Marx since 67 to 71, realized that he was going nearer and nearer to some Adorno's position. He hated the Frankfurt School. Then there is the social situation which changed a lot of things. He entered into crisis, also because of this issue about dialectics, the contradiction, etc. He did this good interview with Perry Anderson in 74, in which he was still Marxist, but in crisis. In 75, 76, he said, bye-bye. Napoleoni was never able to think alone. Here, in a sense, I am similar to him. And he lost the philosophical hand. So what he did, he inverted the position of Colletti. Colletti, when went away, said, okay, Marx, the scientist, would be good, but Marx, the philosopher, is a disaster. Napoleon said, oh no, it is opposite. Marx, the philosopher, is very good. So he went from Marcuse to Heidegger to St. Thomas, and so on. Yes, and then he died. On the other hand, Colletti ended with Berlusconi, so not too happy. But in Valore it is a great book. The chapter on Marx, before you arrive to the transformation, is good. And there he writes, with machinery, the technical form adapts itself to the social form. The social domination of capital and the material domination of the machine becomes two sides of the same reality. I think this is reproducing Marx in this chapter. And then, says Napoleon, but I think it is something that you can get from Marx in this chapter. The abstraction of labor itself comes to perfection. Now it is no longer a question of the fact that labor counts as abstract labor at the beginning of Capital Volume 1, because it produces nothing other than money. But now, more specifically, the point is that labor is abstract because it is without, I wrote qualities, but it is without properties, ohne Eigenschaften, like music. Because all its properties are to be found outside of it and comes from an exteriorized knowledge and will. This has nothing to do with the notion that you find in the Grundrisse, which is not a good notion, in which Marx says, okay, abstract labor is unskilled labor because capital tends to produce unskilled labor. This he says several times, but it is not the main point. For me, the main point is this one. The abstraction of labor, because labor is manipulated by capital so that it is a labor producing money and more money. I have 5 minutes, you give nothing. Is there life on Mars? Maybe some of you know from this. The idea was, of course, of David Bowie. I think that in Marx we have, as I said, the key role of the notion of the immediately socialized worker. It is shaped by technological design under capital. It is something that exists only since capital at the age of machines. It is a situation in which we have an ex ante immediately social labor in production. But this ex ante immediately social labor still needs to be validated in circulation against money ex post. The notion of the socialization, Vergesellschaftung of labor, that you have at the end of chapter 1. If you ask what is common, this gives you an idea of what is common. It is not the return of an original situation. Common is what it is easy to say, is that historical unique reality in which labor is both immediately social in production and validated ex ante as social labor in a society of free and equal human beings, where free and equal is not only formal, but let's go with real. The point for Marx is always, and this chapter an example, the point is that the immediate socialization of labor in production, this comes from capital putting together the workers to exploit them, but to do this, it cannot but put them together, and this is the condition of conflict and antagonism. The drama is that today's capitalism may have broken this. I think, and I have not the time to go into that it is not true anymore that centralization and concentration goes together. To be quick, I think that we live in an era in which the major tendency is centralization of capital without concentration. And with the new technique, also say Industry 4.0, 4.0, etc., capital seems or appears, I don't know, to be able to connect workers from the point of view of exploiting them without relating them to each other socially so that they can fight capital. If it's not clear to you what I'm saying, go and see one movie of Ken Loach. Very often he treats this thing. One it is Meek, there are 4 names about Thatcher. The reality is this one. There is an Italian guy who is going forward in the tradition of Raniero Panzieri and Vittorio Risero, who was a close friend of mine, and it is Matteo Gaddi. You should invite him next year, I think. There is possibility of desperation. Then it happens to me that I read also Luxembourgian or Bolshevik, I don't know, newspapers like Financial Times. And in the Financial Times, Sarah O'Connor wrote a wonderful article, When Your Boss is an Algorithm, go and read it. And she speaks of the struggles of Uber and Deliveroo. They couldn't connect in the production process, but those on strike became clients of themselves, so they met the other workers, and a lot of struggles went on, and they went in judizio, to trial, and they won, and this is happening all over the world. The social subject and struggle are not given spontaneously. For me, this is the point of view. They are a construction, and you can write this before. It is not a theoretical difficulty, it is a practical challenge for challenges. So I entitled the collection in which this is the life on Marx is in Italian, The Untimely Marx. Why untimely? Because of course I remind Nietzsche, who you find untimely as that situation in which one is against time, and in this way about time, and hopefully in a favor of a time to come. So it's not timely in the usual meaning. If you give me 1 minute and a half, the question, Marx is a standpoint of labor or not? I have the impression that everywhere in the world the idea is not. Marx is the theory of social domination. It cannot be the standpoint of labor. The workers are included. Moshe Postone was quite vocal in this, among others. My answer to the question, Marx is a standpoint of labor or not, is yes. Of course he has a standpoint of labor. It is the standpoint of the workers, the centrality of labor, who are fighting the obsessive centrality of production for production. So they are fighting against their position as the center of the social totality. So positively this means the construction of a social subject which is plural, that we use this term. The workers whom I had contact in Turin at the beginning were like this Stefano Gaudenti, who in an interview 68, 69, it should have been published by Corriere della Sera. It was not. It was published by Manifesto 20 years later. He wrote, he said, I want to explain the decisive points of this struggle. He's talking of Fiat, the famous auto. The wildcat strike, the contractual struggle that Fiat sought to stop by suspending 30,000 workers. The boss, with the wage, thinks that he buys a worker, living labor power, like you buy a kilo of apples. You sell yourself and I pay you. Then I consume you however I want to. For me, exploitation is the consumption of the entire working day. I chop up the apple that I bought, I cook it, then I let it rot, I buy it. The fate of the commodity is that of letting itself be consumed. But the worker is a bit of a special commodity. It is not enough to sell it for a good price. It does not want to let itself be consumed just the way it pleases the bosses. It is a commodity that wants to have power to control every day how it is consumed. That is why there are now internal struggles over work for workers' control. In Turin, in Piemonte, mid-60s, there were new struggles about the health of the workers. Go in the pages which Marx speaks of the changes as injurious to the health of the workers. A few years later, probably Marx would say, no, maybe they were before Stone, but in Venice, at Marghera, there was this struggle against the inusability of labor. In Turin, they were probably near the traditional trade unions, the manifesto, and things like that. In Venice, they were more of the workers' tradition. I don't like very much the workers' theory, but the workers' experience in the factories was great, and I invite you to read the book by Steve. I think this is a key point, and if you want to historicize my reading of Marx, it comes simply from the fact that I was formed also by these guys. You know, there, with my comrade and wife Joanna Vetro, we have a famous page. Yeah.
So, genau. Gerne. Fragen
production of machinery and technology was missing. The reason why machines and technology are productive only by socialized labor is not because of how workers work, that they work harder or 24/7, but because only when machines can only increase productivity on the level of relative surplus production when they lower the reproduction costs of the labor power. And the fascinating thing and the reason why capitalism is based on socialist labor is that the introduction of machinery and technology is not reducing the wages and the reproduction cost of the individual capital, but of the workers of the world, so to say. So if in China new machines and new technologies are introduced, then it affects the wage and the reproduction costs of the labor class in Europe, in the US, etc. Or when in Saudi Arabia new technologies are used in the oil production, it's not that the workers there at the Öltor, at the oil production, are harder exploited, but the real exploitation happens, for example, with the US working class who have to commute with their car to their workplace. So I think we have to look, when we speak about socialized labor, at this level of the mode of producing relative surplus. And not only, like operates and also a little bit in your talk, focusing on how extra profit is gained or how absolute surplus is gained by using machines and technology. I don't know if I made my point clear back. It was a long day. Maybe I can repeat it in German if it's too
no.
Wir sammeln ein paar Fragen und dann geht Riccardo darauf ein. Vorne war noch eine Meldung. Genau, und hinten glaube ich auch noch ein paar.
Yeah, you were referring, and thank you for your talk, you were referring to this new tendency that we see in actual digital capitalism, where we do not have a centralization without concentration, meaning, for example, in platform work, where the capitalist is assigning work tasks to workers independently with a structure, but the structure is not the structure of collaboration that Marx was describing in the classical model of a centralized establishment or company where workers come together to work. Now they work decentralized within logics of fragmentation of capitalist production through digitalization. And I think when you came to this point, I didn't clearly get why you think that we have a new form right now, apart from that it's being digitally organized, remotely done worldwide in that level. But I think from the general understanding of Marx, to think about capital as the logic of breaking workflows, assigning work tasks to workers, and expropriating the workers from their value production and from the providing the means of production and exploiting the workers. And I would think that we still have the same happening in digital capitalism, that where you were saying, is there still Marx in, and is Marx the appropriate way to analyze it? And I would say yes, it's appropriate way, but we may have to rethink the logics of capital in digital capitalism.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back to the distinction you picked up on the capitalist use of machine and this Kantian notion of a machine in itself. And I would like to expand a bit more on one thing also where you might locate Marx on this binary between eco-modelism and degrowth, yeah, on a question of the domination of nature, and as well on this question of labor processes, where you have also on one end of the spectrum this Leninist fascination for Taylorism, on the other hand people like Raniero Panzeri, Braverman, and so on. Yeah, and we'd be very much interested in your marks there. And as another question also, this question whether it might not be better to speak or think about socialist use of machinery rather than this idea of a machine in itself.
Ok.
Fino a che ci sono. Finché le scrivo, le ho preso.
My questions are a little bit more theoretical orientated. I don't refer to the latest development of capitalism. First, just a detail. When you spoke about machinery and relative surplus value connected with absolute value, in your slide, it was the formulation: the machinery produces relative surplus value by putting the labor to a higher degree. Did you really meant that the machine produces surplus value, what also includes value? I think this would be a big innovation for Marxist theory, or was it just a phrase in a foreign language? My second point regarding chapter 5 of Kapital, you mentioned briefly the discussion about break and continuity in Marx, and in the discussion about the essence of human labor. And you mentioned, you see that Althusser stresses the break, and you would follow him to a certain part, but not completely. Something this I understood, and maybe you can give a little bit more information to this. And also, just to give a small idea, Marx didn't speak of essence, but he speaks in chapter 5 of the nature of humans. Maybe this is not only a difference of word, perhaps it's a difference in concept. And then my third and last point, at the end of your presentation, there was a lot of talk about the immediate socialized worker. And then when you mentioned communism, you said it is easy to say the labor has to be social in production and validated ex ante. And this is easy to say but difficult to do. And here I had the impression that the notion socialized, immediate socialized worker perhaps should be related to what Marx called in the first chapter the immediate socialized labor, when he talks about the third peculiarity of the equivalence form, that concrete labor appears as immediately socialized labor, and this at the end results in money. So is the whole difficulty in communism, what you stressed, exactly to get rid of any exchange, to get rid of money, but nevertheless to have a form of this immediately socialized labor, unmittelbar vergesellschaftete Arbeit. So that this is the difficulty, but also you can follow this trace in chapter 13, where you found this notion of the immediately socialized worker.
Wir sammeln jetzt alle Fragen. Die letzte vielleicht jetzt.
I have a question with respect to the tendency of the rate of profit fall, because I think in your presentation of the fragment on the machines, I think there's a strong similarity with the logic of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that living labor is replaced by machinery, so less and less labor with respect to the value of the machines, and that's why surplus value diminishes with respect to the value already accumulated. And I think in the fragment of the machines, you have a similar logic that labor is pushed out of the process of production or is pushed aside, whereas machines dominate. So do you think there is a connection between the fragment on the machines and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or do you think these are two different theories, are two different moments of theory?
May you repeat louder the part about the falling rate of profit tendency, so I understand better how you get it. Sorry.
Well, I think the logic of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is the replacement of living labor by dead labor, so to speak, by machines. So, and if you say only living labor the source of value or the source of surplus value, for that reason, Marx claims that the rate of profit has a tendency to fall. And similarly with machinery with the fragments on machines.
Okay. This is the point in which I should answer to some things maybe, to other I'm not sure, to other I don't know, and lastly to other I will study that more. There's also the possibility I spoke and wrote in a non-completely defined way. But let us say something more. I go in order because I have no time to put them differently. The first was about the immediately socialized worker. If I understood well, the point was that the stress must be put on the extraction of relative surplus way labor can that lower labor power, and there is not so much of harder exploitation. My answer shortly will be that if and when I see Marx, I will tell this that probably was not so clear. That is, what I did here was to read the chapter 11, 12, and 13. And from that, there were some questions about categories and some questions about reality. There was no attempt to be exhaustive about that. Now, my answer here is, in this chapter 13, I see very much the stress by Marx that you cannot divorce, at least in certain phases, not of Kapital, but of technical progress, technical change, etc. You cannot divorce extraction of relative from extraction of surplus value, and in the extraction of relative surplus value, you must introduce the notion of intensity of work at the core. Personally, I think that one way or another, not exactly in the terms of this chapter, these two notions seems to be fertile, to be pursued, to look at reality also with those lenses, because otherwise you lose part of what is going on. It's not the only thing which is going on. So, but maybe I didn't get the point thoroughly. About what I call the centralization without concentration. You know, Marx has this idea that the centralization of capital was going on together with concentration. The idea of concentration was that I have to give a caricature, that the same capital becomes bigger and bigger. So you go from firm, small, medium, to the integrally vertically integrated firm. Centralization are mergers are capitals joining together with some mechanism and becomes big. This, if I remember well, is a notion after the second edition that Marx wrote for the French edition, and then went back to the third and fourth edition of Kapital. This became more or less an article of faith for good reasons. We had the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Rosa Luxemburg in 1899, if I remember well, made a polemic against Bernstein. And in this polemic, there was an argument in which she said, look, in Capital, things don't go linearly. There is a cycle, both for firms and for workers. There is a tendency to concentration for firms, but this does not mean that there are not phases in which the small firms comes back. Even, she says, this is good for capital because it is there that there is the innovation for factories, and then the big capital gain from this innovation. I sent this to Giacomo Beccattini. You don't know who is Giacomo Beccattini, but it was a great name in Italy who rediscovered the notion leftist, the notion of Marshall districts, and he saw that as important and leftist. It was the system of these small, medium firms in Toscana, Emilia-Romagna, etc. And he was an enthusiast of this. For the worker, there is a tendency to the unification of the working class and a counter tendency to, which happens, division, fragmentation, or Bernstein more or less said, this means, my view, which was different than Luxembourg, that since the Kapital operation, share capital, the savings of workers going on buying shares, etc., and in order that capitalism becomes more and more stable. So you may do a revolution, but not for the objective reality. My impression I did my dissertation on Luxembourg, is that actually what Luxembourg saw as the tendencies became the counter tendencies in capitalism after the 80s. So from a certain point of view, Bernstein was not totally wrong. But the capitalism that then was created was more unstable and not more stable. One of the reasons was that there was China may be a particular example with different elements, but the point is that we didn't have the break of the vertically integrated factory going back to the small and medium firm of the past. You had a new configuration of networks of firms which are not bigger, they are related to one each other. The positions of dominance in the value chain may be differently located, not necessarily with the last firm, etc. So there was the creation of a system in which there was less concentration, because not anymore, in my view, there is the bigger factory with more homogeneous workers, more workers, etc. It didn't went in this way, but it went in a situation in which capital was more centralized and the chain of production had a different construction. So it is a new reality which cannot just be analyzed with the old notions. This for me appeared clear after the 70s, 80s, because in Italy there was the district phenomenon of the district industries was the key of the Italian miracle. Japan was a particularly different experience. In Germany there were the high manufacturing. There were these two guys from the US, Michael Piore, Charles Sable, who wrote a book on the fact that now capitalism was taking the road to mass production that Adam Smith would have liked, but it didn't happen in Europe. And Smith thought it could happen in the United States. And it was the period in which Europe and Japan were the winner, were thought as the winner, and US were thought as the loser. Then after 95, the thing changed completely. So I started reading this literature, and there was the discussion of what I'm saying to you. Simply, the Americans, United States economists and sociologists, for reasons that they don't understand, use the opposite expression. That is, concentration without centralization. But they mean exactly what they mean. So I use the Marxian categories, and I think it is the other way around. Somebody named Fordism and Taylorism. I think this point is important, but for another thing that I wanted to say, but I had no time and I didn't say it, and here I just say provocatively. In my view, if Marx is right, it is a profoundly anti-Smithian view, and from that point of view, as I see it, logically, not historically may be the opposite, but logically, Fordism is the condition of the success of Taylorism, because the change starts from the instruments of labor, and it defines the organization of labor into the factory. So, Taylorism, when it began, was the increase of the intensity of labor with given technical situation. You go historically, it was a disaster. It was a disaster. What it did, it created conflict, social conflict. Then came First World War. And then it was applied, and it won in the First World War, because there was the national emergency. In the national emergency, you do that. Then what was winning was the factory of Ford, which utilized all the elements of the social innovations, the innovation, social, in the organization of labor. I think this probably could be utilized to understand Toyotism and what is happening after. That is, I would invert. There is not a sequence tailored for it. If you want to speak of a logical sequence, you should put the thing upside down. Kapital is machinery as machine in itself. I didn't use in itself, I use as such. The point of Marx is there is the machine and it is how it is used. We would be stupid not to use the machine in a way which reduces the working time. As I said, I have no answer, but I think that Marx himself gives question. It cannot be the machine as we know them. They should be different machines. About the point about Braverman, Panzieri, and so on. In my view, when I said I didn't go into any detail, but I think that the view of degradation of labor, tendency to less skill of labor, etc., explains something but not too much. All the debate after, I have in mind people like Michael Burawoy or I think Andrew Friedman, all the people of the CSE, Labor Process Group in Brighton, etc., gave a much more nuanced analysis. In particular, Burawoy gave the real question that usually Marxists do not deal with. The point is not to understand why workers do not revolt. The point is rather, and then because they are beaten, etc. The point is that workers collaborate. There is a moment of concept. There is no labor process which would work even in the chain of Ford, etc., without workers actively making it work. There are very good good papers and books on this in French by Thomas Coutron. So I think that this issue about, you see that I expressed conflict, class struggle in production, but at the same time, this point of consent is crucial. And to be provocative, my idea is that in the workers' theory, what is lacking is the presence of workers when they work. When they work, they are not there. Either they are not working against capital, or they are a clog in the machine. Yes, it would be nice to know what is the socialist use of machinery. The questions of Michael. The first one was about relative surplus value.
What is
there? That's all right. just before sending it, I gave a look at this, and I said, oh, I should go to the German and the Italian too, and look if it is produces, it produces. Frankly, I don't know. What I know for sure is that Marx is referring to lavoro potenziato, labor of a higher degree, as in maybe I cut something that is machinery produces situation, it is able to enforce relative surplus values. No? The point to which I am a bit aficionado, that I like, is this idea that, look, there is the increase of the productive power of labor that allows, but look at the transition. The transition is crucial, and it is in that transition that you need to enforce high intensity, prolonged working day, etc. Chapter 5. I agree completely with you. It's fair like this, I would be more careful. I agree with you that there is not any more the discourse of the essence, that as such is poiema. What I think is that if you look from the point of continuity, and if you look from the point of discontinuity, from both points of view, you are losing something. So, if one does an analysis of the evolution and changes of Marx thought, as the difficulty, there is no ambiguities, a lot of that. But you can build a rigorous argument in which you see break or even breaks. Then if you look with more refined glasses, you say, oh, it was in 45. No, it wasn't. I think that to certain points he got lost about when the real a good break was. So for sure, from that point of view, the discontinuists are right. But they are losing something that the others, in their own way, are saying. And in their own way, it cannot be accepted because there is this notion of the essence, in the case of Napoleone, but then also of Colletti. There is this idea that there was an original unity which was broken, and then you have to put it together again. If you follow what I said, here and there, I said, no, it's not so, it's not so, it's not so. So from that point of view, it is wrong. But you use what I tried to say, not with the wording of essence, but that point, let us put it this way, of the genericity of the human being does not disappear. It is historicized. Let us say in the Grundrisse, probably maybe before, maybe later, I don't know. But that historization is not enough. But when you go to Kapital, you see that at a certain point, this thing reappears. And reappears even in formulations that sometimes are naive, funny and naive. There is a footnote about the refusal of war in which he quotes a guy who say, oh, I changed one work or another because I lost my job. I went to the United States. I saw that they changed a lot here and there. I did that, and I was able to do this and that and that, and I felt like a human being and not some kind of nobody. And there is no irony in that from Marx. So I think there is something which cannot be exaggerated, because otherwise you finish in the Engels phrase that Marx criticizing ideology when he said, oh, in the morning you do this, in the afternoon you do that. But to be fair, it is not in the morning and in the afternoon, but sometimes it seems so. You can go out of that being so if you move from the individual dimension to the collective worker. Then you have the problem of how you organizing this collectivity so that there is not another. So it's a lot to be discussed. What I think is that if you do the operation that they said, let us go back. Let us start from Kapital, chapter 13, and see how this relates to what was before. We are not saying that it is the same thing, but there is a same problem which is in which there is a change in category and the notions, and it is grasped differently. But the problem does not disappear. You are right, I was probably too quick in the expression, but I think also in the writing, when we talk about communism, I don't know where it is, but the point is, in the age of the machines, there is the origination of the unmittelbar Gesellschaft Arbeit. So, labor cannot be done in common, in production, by workers together, organized, let us say according to a plan, going quickly. And this is a new situation. We don't go back from that in communism. But in communism, as you said, we should have a situation in which you don't have a ex post socialization of labor finally in situation, which is related to the validation in my export. So in communism there must be a way to have an immediate social labor in that sense, ex ante. As you said, you have to get rid of exchange, you have to get rid of money, etc. You know, Napoleon, Smith, Riccardo Marx, in the second edition, he put away the essays he had 2 years before on Marx, in Smith, Riccardo Marx. He maintained the essay on physiocrats, on Smith, on Riccardo, all away, one lecture on abstract labor. In the end of this lecture, he talks about this position coming from the Quaderni Rossi, criticizing Soviet Union, that kind of socialism, but criticizing that kind of socialism from the point of view of the notion of total capital. And he said, rightly, according to me, that notion is